Hello, and welcome to the Ultimate Bannerlord Beginner's Guide, hosted by Commando Cal. Welcome to the channel. Please remember to hit the like and subscribe button if you like these tips and this overall guide, starting off on your journey through Bannerlord. First tip will be character creation. You want to make sure that you choose your starting culture and character stats based on what you'll actually use, not on what sounds good in your personal quote-unquote backstory. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we look here at, say, Sturgians, they're descendants of foreign tribes of northern Calradia. As the Empire expanded into their cold forests, they found that they had a ready market for their furs, woodland animals, and they became princes, good hunters, wanderers, and they travel far in search of opportunities both for trade and plunder. So that sounds cool. They sound almost like these northern Viking trader people who have furs and they're great merchants. But then if you actually look at the faction bonus, you only get 20% less speed penalty from snow. So while that's great and all, when you need it, you're not going to be in snow that often. And for when it really counts, it's not worth it, in my opinion. Vlandians have one really good starting one, and that's just because of how the game operates as you get very start of the game when you start growing your own warband. The first thing you have here is 20% more upgrade XP to troops from battles. So if you recruit peasants and you're just starting out, or even if you're later in the game, you have a large army and you've taken a ton of casualties, and you've recruited brand new peasant troops or fresh recruits that are low tier, maybe 1 or 2, this is going to help a ton. Another one that's very good is the Azurai caravans, having 30% cheaper to build, so 10% less trade penalty. The reason why this is valuable is because to make any caravan in the game period, you need to spend 15,000 gold, which again later in the game won't be as big of a deal. But when you're first starting out, maybe you're mostly clearing bandit camps, fighting in tournaments, or fighting smaller groups of bandits that are lower tier. 15,000 gold is huge, and so that's a 5,000 gold reduction. That makes every caravan only 10,000. So if you have 2 caravans at 10,000 gold, you've only spent 20. If you had gone with any of these other faction bonuses, you would have spent 30 grand. So you've already saved 10,000 gold on 2 caravans, which is huge, especially beginning of the game. So we're going to go with Vlandians and push forward here. So what I said before about choosing your character stats based on what you'll actually use is also important. So you are born into a family of a baron's retainers, merchants, maybe you're personally into that kind of thing, yeomen, so maybe you like pole arms and crossbows. Just make sure that you choose your skill level or your focus points and attribute points based on what you're actually going to use. Personally, I never use ranged weapons unless they're throwing weapons. That's just how I play. So in this section, I'm only going to choose, say, the point of smithing and two-handed, or the point to trade and charm. And I also don't use pole arms, so I wouldn't use that one. And just, pick these ones based on what you'll actually use. Ignore the stories are great to read. They give the game a lot more immersion and a backstory and culture, and the developers have done really well on this part. But really just stick to what will have concrete impacts on your stats over here on the left. Ignore the story. Don't pick anything based on your education or your job. It won't actually have an effect on the game itself. Tip number 2, do join a faction early on. Do join a faction early on. Why is that? Well, number 1, you gain valuable experience fighting alongside allies. Even if your personal army is smaller, the army you roll with will give you and your troops much needed experience, loot, which includes weapons, horses, armor, food, prisoners, and trade goods, which can be sold for a profit in some cities. More profit in some cities than others, which we'll go over later. Whether you support one faction or you decide you want to become a king of all Calradia and make your own faction, befriending lords will allow you to recruit them as generals working for you in your quest to conquer the continent. There are 2 ways to join a faction. 1, becoming a mercenary, and 2, becoming a vassal. Becoming a mercenary is good at the very beginning if you need gold, because you're basically just a sword for hire, and that means you're only paid gold and more gold based on how well you fare against an enemy faction. It can be as low as 10 gold per day, and I've seen it go as high as 500 gold per day, depending on how good you were faring against factions you're at war with. Become a vassal, however, and the rewards are much better. The influence you gain with your faction will not only let you vote for who among your fellow lords gets a castle or town, but you can spend extra influence on persuading the lord to give it to you as well. That means if you're gifted a castle or town, you are now in control of a potentially huge source of income in the game. Upgrade your fiefs' amenities, keep the roads free of bandits, and prevent enemy lords from raiding your villages, and you will be a very rich dude.
I am going to be a very rich dude.
Tip number 3, getting supplies and troops when you're part of another army. When you've joined a faction and see a big army marching around, or get a notification that one of the lords is building an army, you can join it and become part of one big mass. While on campaign with these armies, control is taken away from you and the AI general in charge takes over. These generals will often stop at villages and towns for supplies or recruits. Make sure that if you're low on food or recruits, you press spacebar or 1 to pause the game. You can now enter the village to buy supplies, recruits, or even begin quests. Once you leave the town or village, you'll rejoin the army without issue. This is really handy so that enemy armies can't ambush you as a straggler. And if you notice your fellow army members' warbands are starving, you can buy a little extra food that gets donated to them for a small bit of influence, which you can track in the bottom left hand of your screen, where all updates are given in the game. It's also a good idea to buy those cheap, locally produced goods here so that you can sell them later at another city, especially one that you capture which may be critically low on certain supplies. Tip number 4, Bandit Hideouts, archers and throwers on holdfire. When attacking bandit hideouts, the archers and anyone with ranged weapons in your group are set to hold fire automatically. If you didn't know that, I'm sure you've charged archers headlong into sword fights they were never going to win, and you wondered why they weren't firing their arrows. Make sure as soon as you spawn at a bandit hideout, you hit F4. A little message on the bottom left of the screen will show now that your ranged units have been set to fire at will. Now they'll start firing arrows, their crossbows, or even throwing their throwing axes at enemy bandits. Tip number 5, shift click and trade all. This is a very quick but very time-saving and useful tip. Have you been out slaughtering looters and want to offload hundreds of items of cheap clothing that's probably covered in sweat and blood?
You look good in that color. Stinks. It's had a dead man in.
Hold shift while clicking on an item's arrow and you will move them in stacks of 5 into the trade menu. If there's less than 5 in a stack, like let's say 2 or 3, it will move that whole stack. Another tip is you can trade all without losing precious items like horses, which we'll get into in a minute. Next to your items in the trade screen is a little empty circle on the far right column that has a header called locked. If you click that, it will fill in yellow. Once you lock everything you don't want to trade, such as blacksmithing resources, horses, food, or anything else, you can now click the 2 big gray arrows at the top of your inventory to trade everything that is unlocked. This makes selling off huge quantities of blood-soaked shoes and other bandit trash that much easier. Tip number 6, keep all horses. Horses, as well as camels and mules, all have inventory space. Now, if you're going for a faster army composition that can move across the campaign map quicker and perhaps outrun enemy armies, not only will you want to get rid of all of your prisoners, but you'll also want to get rid of camels and mules and sumpter horses as well. However, if you want that inventory space, I suggest you keep all of those pack-loving animals so that they can carry all of your loot across the map. You'll see your max quantity at the top of your inventory screen go up anytime you acquire new horses, mules, camels, etc. This is extremely useful for when you come upon a variety of very cheap goods in one town that stack in the hundreds, like even grain sometimes you can sell at a profit. Even if you only profit 10 gold per trade good, do the math. If you sell 500 items at 10 gold each, that's a profit of 5,000 gold. Keep that in mind when there's donkeys as loot. They're more valuable than you think. Tip number 7, trade goods. At first glance, something like olives, tools, or flax bundles may seem useless, but some cities either have no access to these things at all, or the tides of war have ravaged the countryside, making for dangerous trade routes and shortages. What did we all learn in 7th grade economics? Supply and demand. While that is true in real life, it's also true in Bannerlord as well. You can get a rough idea of what a good might sell for in nearby cities just by hovering over it and looking at trade rumors. These rumors are by no means complete, and sometimes they won't hold true if a trade caravan gets to a town and offloads a huge amount of that resource before you do, thus satisfying the demand by increasing the local supply. You can always hold on to your goods as you travel and look for better deals as you explore the various cities in the game. Again, if you have all those horses and camels, even if you're riding a little slower, it's worth it. Tip number 8, press N. N is for enciclopedia. By pressing N, you will see a whole slew of categories of the game's information. One of the best to check out first is under Heroes. You can filter heroes by Wanderer, which will allow you to see all the companions in the game file, including their stats. Not sure if you want to hire that healer, or that guy with the weird last name like The Wronged, or The Black, or Willowbark? Well, you can look them up in the encyclopedia by name and see if they're worth the gold you're about to drop to recruit them. You can also use N to search for the best marriage partners in the game by clicking on different characters and seeing which ones are unmarried and comparing their stats. Tip number 9, B is for banner. If you press B, you can actually retroactively edit your banner at any time in the game. Whether with the base banner editor or a mod added to the game, you can go into this banner editor at any time and change your colors, the size, the symbol, etc. Tip number 10, the 3 types of settlements and what they are used for. There are 3 types of settlements in Bannerlord: villages, castles, and towns. Each have their own uses, quests, economic, and military value. It's very important that you know all these if you want to have a successful campaign in the world of Mount and Blade Bannerlord. Now, let me know if you'd like me to make another video going over these 3 settlement types in greater detail, but for now, I'll go over the basics. The first settlement type are villages, which are best for early game quests, building reputation by completing those quests successfully, buying higher and higher quality troops from those villages when your reputation grows, and finally buying cheap trade goods that are produced locally in that village, while traveling often not very far to a nearby town to sell those trade goods at a very handsome profit. The second settlement type are castles. The main value in castles is in defense. These settlements are usually situated on cliff sides, holding checkpoints, and overlooking mountain passes and valleys. Castles act as an anchor and projection of strength and regional power of a lord or faction. These bulwarks of force act as a bank for troops to garrison and as a kind of shield or deterrent for the general area. If you have 400 troops in the castle garrison, the enemy AI will think twice about raiding that local area or mounting a siege on the castle itself. When you get to the late, maybe early middle part of the game, when you are now attacking enemy settlements, it doesn't make much strategic sense to skip over a heavily defended and garrisoned castle to attack a city further into the interior of a kingdom, even if it's more lightly defended. And I'll explain why. The city itself may be a softer target and easier to take in the short run, but once captured, your armies will most likely be drained of strength and you'll need some time to heal and recruit new troops. The nearby castle, which your enemy still controls, again acting as an anchor for the local countryside, will be used to rally troops against you and cut your new city off from the rest of your empire. There's a chance that enemy lords are also holed up in that castle you decided to pass over, which means they could leave and conduct raids on their own, or even hit you in your backside while you're vulnerable, constructing siege equipment. This puts your new prize of a city, fought over long and hard by your witless peasants and your allies, at huge risk to being easily recaptured by the enemy faction. If the enemy does happen to lay siege and they do recapture it, it will be a very quick affair, and they will now be able to use the opportunity to blitzkrieg into your territory and begin raiding or capturing cities and castles of their own. This is why, in my opinion, in the long run, capturing castles along the way is vitally important. Shore them up with defenders and prisoners to recruit from later on, and use that castle as a springboard for your eventual assault and hopefully successful siege of the nearby enemy city. Last, but certainly not least in the 3 settlement types, are the moneymakers. Towns, aka cities. Towns or cities, in my opinion, are the most valuable of the 3 settlement types in Mount and Blade 2 Bannerlord. The villages in the surrounding area, which are quote-unquote bound to the city, are what provide a major amount of the city's prosperity and growth over time. Cities can have very profitable tax incomes, even if they're only moderately prosperous economically, which you can view by clicking on the city and looking at its prosperity number at the top left of your screen. You can also find the city's most stable workshops, if not the most lucrative, by looking at which villages are bound to it by hovering over the city with your mouse and looking at the village list. You can also look at faraway cities' bound villages by again clicking N for encyclopedia and searching for that city there. This will allow you to plan ahead and open workshops far away from the front lines of war. Now, getting back to what bound villages produce, let's say that a city has 3 villages bound to it, one producing grain, but the other 2 produce grapes. It's probably a good idea to open a wine press workshop, which presses the local grapes and ferments them into wine, which will then be sold as a finished product in the local city where the villages are bound to. But since wine is a rare commodity in other cities, trade caravans, even caravans from enemy factions, will buy bottles of wine there and sell them for a profit elsewhere, making you profit with very little work. Overall, in my humble opinion, cities are the most valuable fiefs, castles being second, and villages as third. Castles produce almost nothing other than some tax income, but since they're so valuable militarily, and this is a game where you pretty much fight non-stop battles over and over, it's safe to say that they're a bit more valuable than villages. As of right now, even if a village is raided, they do repair and regenerate relatively fast, even on realistic settings, which is what I play on, as of April 29th, 2020. Thank you for joining me on this Ultimate Bannerlord Beginner's Guide. Remember to crush that like and subscribe button, and hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload a brand new video. While I do my best to respond to all of your comments, I do read them all, so if you have any comments or suggestions for my next video, leave them below. I've been your host, Commando Cal. Until next time.